Hello everyone, and welcome to Fresh Master Channel. Today, we are going to have some story from Reddit. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe, like the video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment down below. These simple clips mean a lot to the future of this channel.
I wasn't always a rancher, and the path that led me here was anything but typical. Before the vast open spaces and the endless demands of ranch life became my reality, I lived a completely different life. A life rooted in the East, far from the Rocky Mountain foothills I now call home. Back then, I wore suits, worked with numbers, and lived in the fast-paced world of the city. Walking away from my connections to organized crime wasn't something I ever imagined, but circumstances, and one moment of uncontrollable anger, pushed me into a new life, far from everything I'd known. When I first arrived here, I knew almost nothing about cattle, horses, or the rhythm of the land. But I quickly realized that the hard work and isolation suited me, giving me a way to stay busy and keep my past at a distance. Over time, the ranch became more than just my job. It became my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in daily tasks and escape the shadows of my old life. But the past has a way of catching up, no matter how far you run or how many acres you put between yourself and your old world. I woke up suddenly, drenched in cold sweat. Another nightmare had probably hit, though I couldn't remember the details. Therapy had helped some, but sleep wouldn't come easily now. The bad dreams would just return. A glance at the clock showed 4:30 a.m., not much earlier than when I usually get up. Might as well start the day. Running a ranch means early mornings and long hours, but it's the life I chose and I wouldn't trade it. With 535,000 acres spread out along the foothills, my nearest neighbor was a good 50 miles away, a fact I was always aware of. After a quick shave and shower, I dressed for the day. By the time I was done, I looked the part, a 40-year-old man with graying hair, a weathered face, and the lean, muscular build ranch life gave me. I was no longer the overweight city guy I'd been, now down to a solid 200 pounds from the 260 I carried in the East. Even my Italian heritage seemed to fade under the sun and wind of the Rockies, though I still found myself alone. I just couldn't bring myself to get close to any of the local women. Not that I didn't go into town to have some fun, but I never found a woman I wanted something serious with. One of my ranch hands once told me, "If you wake up with the same woman you had last week, it's time to head into town." So I followed that advice. As I got older, the trips became less frequent, but I guess that happens to everyone. I made coffee and took a cup into my office, planning to start the day a little early. I turned on the TV and tuned into a national news network. I love having my satellite dish. It lets me stay connected to the world while still enjoying the rural life. Plus, my dude ranch guests would go crazy without it. This was a working ranch. We had herds of beef cattle, we bred horses, sheep, and even a few buffalo. After living here for about 5 years, a small family drove up my driveway one day pulling a travel trailer. They asked if they could camp on my land. They earned a lot of points with me just by asking. Most people, inconsiderate pricks that they are, just set up camp without permission. I usually had to send one of my guys to kick them out. I don't know why I said yes this time. Maybe it was because they asked. Maybe it was the hopeful look in their son's eyes. Or maybe I was just in a good mood after breakfast. Whatever it was, I sent one of my hands to help them pick a spot near the stream, under the trees, but close enough to the ranch where they could use electricity, water, and the bathrooms. That evening, there was a knock at my door. The boy stood there with a big plate of cookies, holding them out to me and saying, "Thanks for letting us stay on your land. It's really nice here." I noticed his father standing in the background with a flashlight, a proud dad watching his son grow up. The boy went on about how his mom made the best cookies in the world, pointing out his favorites. I raised my voice so the dad could hear me, thanked the boy, and invited both of them in for milk and cookies. We had a nice time. The boy got me thinking about my own kids. It had been a long time since I'd left, without even saying goodbye. The next morning, I was working some horses in a corral near the main barn when I noticed the father and son watching me. I was due for a break, so I rode over to where they were standing at the fence. The boy immediately reached for the horse's head to pet him. The horse I was on, though, was a mean stallion that would bite anyone who got close. I shouted at the boy not to touch him. He jumped back, eyes welling with tears. I didn't mean to yell so loud and scare him, and I felt awful. I got off the horse, knelt down, and explained that the horse might bite and I didn't want him to get hurt. After I finished, the boy hugged me. Feeling bad, I took him to the barn to see a newborn colt we hadn't let outside yet. She was as gentle as they come, so I let him into the stall to touch her. He asked a million questions about the foal and her mother. I think I made a lifelong friend, because for the next week, the boy was always right by my side. The father apologized for his son's behavior, but I told him, "No problem, I enjoy the company." As the week went on, I bonded with the kid. He was about the same age as my son back east, who I hadn't seen in years. I guess the boy was filling a void I didn't realize I had. The little family stayed for a week, and during that short time, the boy won over all the ranch hands. We were all sad to see them go. That fall, I decided to start a family-oriented dude ranch. There wasn't much to do to prepare, as the ranch already had 6 cabins with electricity and running water. I had my guys clean them up, install water heaters, and make any other necessary improvements. My main house was huge. The dining room seated 30 people, and the living room was just as spacious. I also had a library full of books on Western history, so we were pretty much ready. We'd figure out the rest as we went along. I placed a small ad in a vacation magazine targeting families back east. I got a handful of replies and a few deposits. Not a great start, but it was something. As the first guest's arrival got closer, I called a meeting with my staff. We decided what activities the guests could do on the ranch, which horses were calm enough for them to ride, which chores they could help with, and what the meals would be. We even restored an old wagon and outfitted it as a chuck wagon for an overnight trail ride to give guests a real Old West experience. It slowly picked up, and within a couple of years, we were fully booked all summer. It was nice having families around. It made the ranch feel alive. One morning, as I sat sipping my coffee, I started reflecting on how I ended up on the ranch. It had been a long and winding road. I used to be a bookkeeper for my Uncle Vito, working in a small office above one of his restaurants. You might not think bookkeeping is a big deal, but my uncle was the head of one of the largest crime families on the East Coast. I managed all his money, both legitimate and, well, not so much. I was well respected in the family. One day we had a small kitchen fire and had to evacuate the building. Since I couldn't work, I went home. The garage was open, so I pulled in and entered through the side door. The house was eerily quiet, but I heard a faint noise from upstairs. For some reason, I grabbed my son's baseball bat from near the door and went to investigate. I quietly crept upstairs and entered my bedroom, where the noise was coming from. What I saw there is something I'll never forget. My wife with another man. She didn't even notice me. I started walking across the room when her lover turned his head and saw me. He smirked. It was Tony D'Amico from a rival crime family. An enemy. The look on his face said it all. He was with my wife to humiliate me. I lost control in a moment of anger, and when I came back to my senses, Tony was seriously hurt. I guess a 260-pound guy with a baseball bat can do serious damage. He was gone. My wife was on the floor. It looked like I'd strike her too, but she was still breathing. I didn't know what to do, so I called my cousin. He told me to calm down, get in my car, and drive to one of his businesses. He would handle the cleanup. When I arrived, I was put in a car and driven 200, 300 miles west, where we switched cars and continued driving for the next 2 days. We ended up at a small motel outside of Reno, Nevada, for a couple of days while I got my head straight. My handler explained that a cleanup crew had made Tony's body disappear and thrown my wife down the grand staircase, making it look like she had fallen. Then they set fire to the bedroom to destroy any evidence of Tony's pass-away. The fire department found my wife at the bottom of the stairs and assumed she had fallen while trying to escape the fire. When I knocked her with the baseball bat, it broke her back. The rough handling she endured afterwards severed her spinal cord at the injury site, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. She lost the ability to use her legs and had no control over her bladder or bowels. I had no sympathy for her after what she did to our marriage. One of her doctors suspected her injuries weren't from a simple fall and wanted to investigate further. However, that doctor quickly dropped the case after acquiring a new cabin cruiser. I assume some of my cousin's associates had a word with him. My 2 children were staying with my elderly parents, who were told that their mother had a boyfriend and that he had hurt her. They believed this explanation because they had overheard her phone calls with Tony. They never asked to visit her in the hospital. That's when my handler dropped the real bombshell. Tony's distant cousin was the don of another crime family, and he had placed a bounty on my head. I could never go home again, and I'd never see my children again. On the last day at the motel, my handler gave me a new briefcase. Inside, I found everything I needed to become Tom Martin. Sam Palmeret no longer existed. My old life was over. I was outfitted in Western clothes, now just another ranch hand. My handler introduced me to another ranch hand, and we drove off in his pickup to start my new life. I snapped back to the present and started my day. It was Monday, and all the guests for the next 2 weeks were due to arrive. That morning, I walked into my office, turned the welcome sign on, powered up my PC, and began the day. Around noon, a limo pulled up to the office. I was outside at the time, and my first thought was, these guests are going to be trouble. People arriving in limos usually were. The back door opened, and 2 teenage kids stepped out. My next thought was, great, spoiled kids with no parents around. I figured they wouldn't last the full 2 weeks. I considered starting a pool with the ranch hands on how long before the kids wanted to leave. They stood around waiting for their luggage, and I thought they looked familiar. But before I could figure it out, one of my regular guests asked me a question. By the time I was done, one of my helpers had already checked the kids in. That evening at dinner, I gave my usual talk about the ranch, explaining what we expected from our guests and what they could expect from us. I reminded them this was a working ranch, not a place that catered to every whim. If they were expecting spa treatments, they were out of luck. But I assured them we'd do everything possible to make their stay unforgettable. I noticed the 2 kids had already made friends with a couple of others and seemed to be getting along. Maybe I'd need to rethink my estimate of their stay. Since this was a working ranch, I spent most of my time actually running it. The ranch hands assigned to the dude ranch guests had to be people persons. They loved the customers, and the customers loved them. When they weren't explaining something, they were entertaining guests with tall tales. About a week later, I heard noise coming from one of the smaller barns where we stored hay and grain for the horses. When I went to check it out, I found one of the teenage boys messing around with one of the girls. I understood teenage hormones, but I couldn't let this go on. So I cleared my throat loudly. They weren't having sex, but they were close. I'd been a teenager once, so I knew what was going through their minds. But in this case, I had to act like her father. I gave the boy a hard stare and said, "Get out, boy." I almost laughed as he bolted for the door, hunched over. Then I turned to the girl, gave her the same look, and told her to finish getting dressed and meet me in the study at the main house. We needed to talk. As I walked out of the barn, I tried to figure out how to handle this. I had no experience raising children, let alone a teenage girl. By the time I reached the house, I decided to approach the conversation as a responsible adult. About 10 minutes later, the girl came into the study still crying. I pointed to a chair across from me and asked if she wanted something to drink. I got myself a soft drink. As she shook her head, I kept my voice calm and imagined what I would want someone to say to my daughter in the same situation. I talked to her for about 35 minutes. I must have gotten a bit carried away because during my "save yourself for someone special" speech, she suddenly looked up at me and said, "You've got my grandmother's eyes and my grandpa's voice and mannerisms." The tears started flowing. "Are you my dad, Sam Palmeret?" I looked into her young face and saw my ex-wife's eyes staring back at me. I remembered those same eyes from when a little girl used to look up at me, reaching out to be held. I said, "I missed you, Danny." The next thing I knew, my daughter Danielle was sitting on my lap, hugging me tightly. We were both crying tears of joy. This was the little girl I never thought I'd see again. She had grown into a beautiful young woman. For the next hour, we sat together, talking and sharing our feelings. Eventually, the conversation turned to my son. She asked me not to say anything to him until she had a chance to talk to him first. She promised she'd speak with him in their cabin after dinner. For the rest of the day, I was completely distracted, wandering around the ranch with my head in the clouds and a goofy grin on my face. The ranch hands couldn't figure out what was going on with me. They knew I hadn't been to town recently and didn't mingle with the guests. After dinner, I was in my office trying to do some paperwork when the door flew open, and a 15-year-old whirlwind rushed in, shouting, "My dad!" The next thing I knew, we were standing in the middle of my office, hugging each other like our lives depended on it. Sammy Jr. had grown into someone I was proud of. The next morning, I grabbed the special cell phone, saddled a horse, and rode out into the hills. I needed some privacy to have a conversation with my Uncle Vito. His son answered the phone, and I said, "Hi, cuz." He hesitated for a moment before replying, "Hi, cubby," with a smile on his voice. Suddenly, we were both talking at once, like a couple of excited kids. Once we calmed down, I told him about my children and asked why they had been put in danger by being sent to me. My cousin explained it had been his father's idea and that he'd put Uncle Vito on the phone. When my uncle came on, he sounded old and tired, but I could hear genuine happiness in his voice. He told me that Don Angelo had died. Since Don Angelo had no one to take over his empire, the council divided it up, with the largest portion going to my uncle. As a result, Uncle Vito lifted the bounty on my head, and it was now safe for me to return home. I paused for a moment, taking in what he said. "Uncle, I've built a life out here. I'm settled now. I can't just leave everything." I promised to come home for Thanksgiving and stay through New Year's. I thanked him for the gift of my children and told him that they would stay with me until school started, if they wanted to. On my way back to the house, the phone rang again. It was my cousin. He explained that my uncle's health was failing, and this would likely be his last holiday with us. My uncle had terminal cancer. I promised to be there for the holidays. That night, I had the housekeeper open up 2 of the extra bedrooms in the main house. I only used the master suite and had closed off the other 6 bedrooms. But now I needed them. The next day, while my kids were busy playing rancher, I had all their belongings moved into their new rooms. When they came running into my office later that day, shouting that someone had stolen their stuff, I just smiled and pointed upstairs. "You've been relocated," I told them. They dashed upstairs to check out their new rooms, and after some noise from the second floor, they came back down smiling. They asked why I had gone to the trouble of moving their things when they were supposed to go back east the next weekend. I explained my phone call with Uncle Vito and told them that if they wanted, they could stay until school started. Their faces lit up. They were thrilled. They said the rooms were beautiful, but wanted to pick up a few things in town to personalize them. I tried to resist, but it was 2 against 1. So I gave in and told them, "Fine, you can take one of the pickups into town tomorrow." As they left for town, I started having second thoughts. I could already imagine the back of that truck piled high when they returned. Sure enough, the truck wasn't completely full, but they had given it their best shot. They told me to stay out of their rooms until they had finished fixing them up, and I didn't see them again for the next couple of days. When the big reveal finally arrived, they marched me upstairs, making me promise not to peek. I had to keep my eyes closed, and when I opened them, I saw the usual teenage stuff. My son's room had posters of sports stars and cars, and somehow he had managed to sneak in a Sports Illustrated swimsuit poster. His sister gave it a disapproving glance and muttered something under her breath that sounded like, "witches." I kept my mouth shut. I wasn't about to get involved, especially since I liked the poster myself. When we got to my daughter's room, it was clear that it had all the feminine touches. This was definitely a young woman's room. As I looked around, I noticed a large framed photo of me on her nightstand, just like the one on her brother's. Her desk was also decorated with framed photos of me, all taken on the ranch. Both of them had told me they wanted my face to be the first thing they saw in the morning and the last thing at night. I felt a lump in my throat. I'd missed so many years with my kids. Over the next few months, we talked about everything that had happened during the 10 years I'd been absent from their lives. One night, when we had run out of things to talk about, they asked me about their mother and why I had left. I had dreaded that moment since the day we reunited, but I knew I had to tell them the truth. I started by recounting that day, leaving work early because of the fire, finding their mother in bed with her lover, losing control, and liquidating him with a baseball bat. I explained how I regretted that act of violence and called my cousin to take care of the situation. I told them how I was given a new identity and told I could never return. My son looked at me and said, "I'm glad she went crazy and ended up in a mental hospital. I never want to see her again after what she did." My daughter sat there, looking sad. I made a mental note to ask Uncle Vito about my ex when I visited to get some closure, as part of me still missed her. But summer came to an end before we were ready, and the kids and I knew it would be nearly 3 months before we'd see each other again. We promised to call and email, but it wasn't the same as seeing their faces every day. Time seemed to crawl, and even though I'd like to say it didn't, those 3 months felt like years. When the time finally came, my whole crew took me to the airport to see me off. They knew most of the story about my divorce and separation from my kids, but they didn't know about the violence or my ties to organized crime. All they knew was that I was eager to see my children again. I arrived back east earlier than expected. I had told the kids I'd be there on Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, but I came a week early. My crew had gotten tired of me moping around the ranch, so they moved everything up and practically shoved me onto the plane. When I reached the gate of my uncle's compound, I pressed the intercom button. A gruff voice responded with a simple, "Yeah?" I asked if my cousin was home and got a maybe in return. So I told him, "Tell him Cub's here." Not 2 minutes later, my cousin came running out, yelling for the gate to be opened. The guards must have thought we were nuts, standing in the middle of the driveway, hugging and calling each other every four-letter word we could think of. Then my kids joined in the hug. By that point, my cousin and I had cleaned up our language. As I looked up, I saw my uncle sitting in the doorway, in a wheelchair, pushed by a nurse. He was a shadow of his former self. I broke away from the group hug and went over to him, wrapping my arms around him. "It's good to be home again. Thanks for making this possible," I said quietly. I looked into his face and saw tears in his eyes. I whispered, "Tough guys don't cry, Uncle. You were always a chicken." His smile brightened his face. "Don't tell anyone," he replied. Later, when we were alone, my cousin told me it was the best his dad had looked in months. He didn't want to know what I whispered, but thanked me for making his father a little happier. We celebrated Thanksgiving with all the family there, close to 400 people in the party house. My cousin thanked everyone for coming and talked about the year ahead. When my uncle was handed the microphone, he spoke a few words about the importance of family. All the men stood and toasted him while the rest applauded. I could tell my uncle was moved, but he couldn't show it. I got up, walked over, took his hand, and was about to speak when he pulled it away, saying into the microphone, "I don't hold hands." That cracked everyone up. There was nothing left for me to do but follow tradition and kiss him on both cheeks. When I finished, he was smiling from ear to ear. I guess he had the last laugh. On Christmas, we celebrated with just the immediate family. My uncle was too weak for anything big. We spent New Year's Day in the hospital, watching him slowly lose his battle with cancer. He passed away on January 5th, peacefully in his sleep. I hoped he'd find his wife again, who had passed 6 years before. When we walked into the funeral home a few days later, I was amazed. The entire place was reserved for him. Flowers filled every corner, and the line of people waiting to pay their respects stretched around the block. It was freezing outside in January, but the mourners were offered hot drinks and sandwiches, a thoughtful gesture that everyone appreciated, though I wasn't sure who had arranged it. The funeral was held at the largest church in the area, with the bishop himself leading the mass. The church was packed to the brim, and the graveside service was no different. I felt a lump in my throat as I watched the casket being lowered into the ground, right next to his wife. They were together again. My children stood by my side throughout, and their eyes were rarely dry. My uncle had been like a father to them after their grandparents passed. Even though they had me back in their lives, they would still miss him. After the funeral, my daughter seemed down for a few days. When I asked her what was wrong, she simply said, "Can we visit Mom?" I had hoped I'd never have to see my ex again. The last time I saw her, she was with my enemy, and the memory was still painfully fresh. But I swallowed my emotions and told my daughter I'd arrange the visit. I asked my son if he wanted to come along. "Hell no," he replied. "I never want to see her again." I made a mental note that he might need help dealing with his feelings about his mother. A few weeks later, my daughter and I pulled up to a state facility. I had learned from my cousin that my uncle had refused to pay for her care, blaming her for everything that had happened to me. She had been declared a ward of the state and was living in a state hospital receiving minimal care. We were directed to a doctor's office inside the facility where my ex-wife's care provider was supposed to meet us. After what felt like forever in the waiting room, my daughter and I were finally shown into his office. Sitting across from us was an Asian man with broken English, a patient folder in front of him that he explained contained my wife's medical history. On his desk sat a towering stack of patient folders, about 18 inches high. I asked, "Are all of these your patients?" He nodded, replying, "Yes, we are short-handed." At that moment, I realized he had no idea who my wife was. I asked him directly, "Does my wife still take her daily run?" Without missing a beat, he said, "Of course." I squeezed my daughter's hand to stop her from exploding. My ex-wife had been paralyzed from the waist down for 14 years. Running wasn't exactly something she was capable of. I requested to visit her ward, so we called an orderly to escort us. When we arrived, we were met by the head nurse, who seemed far more familiar with my ex-wife's condition. She explained that my ex had completely withdrawn, hadn't spoken in almost 12 years, and had developed extreme paranoia. isolating herself in an attempt to protect herself from imagined threats. The nurse took us to the day room where my ex-wife was seated. I barely recognized her. Once a beautiful woman at 5'6" and 110 pounds, she now weighed nearly 300, her hair unkempt and stringy, confined to a wheelchair. Her face had the distant, vacant look often seen in the severely mentally ill. My daughter approached her, speaking softly, but it was clear that nothing was registering. I could see the heartbreak in my daughter's eyes as she tried to reach her mother. I went to comfort her, but just then, my ex's eyes locked on mine. For a brief moment, there was a flash of recognition, and then she started screaming at the top of her lungs, thrashing her arms as if trying to fend off an unseen attacker. 2 orderlies rushed over to restrain her, and the nurse administered a sedative, which knocked her out cold. The nurse turned to me and said, "That's the first time she's reacted to anything in 5 years." She took our contact information and promised to call if there were any changes. As we left that depressing institution, my daughter broke down in the car, crying uncontrollably. I could barely hold myself together. On the way back to my uncle's compound, I promised her that I would look into transferring her mother to a private facility closer to the ranch. While I told myself I was doing it for my daughter, part of me sought closure too. After returning to the ranch, I started my search and eventually found a well-respected mental health facility about 100 miles away. I visited the place, and it looked promising. The doctors and staff were professional and genuinely cared for their patients. The head doctor was someone who had helped me with my nightmares years ago, and we sat down to discuss my ex-wife's condition. I told him about her violent reaction when she saw me at the state hospital. The doctor wasn't pleased by her outburst, but it confirmed that she had some awareness of what was happening around her, even if it was buried deep. He believed that with time and proper care, she might make some progress. We arranged for her transfer, and I called my daughter with the good news. This time her tears were of relief. A couple of months passed, and the doctor called to ask if I could send a photo of myself. When I asked why, he said he'd explain later. I sent an 8x10 photo of me taken at the ranch. Life got busy. Between helping my daughter visit colleges and settling both kids back at the ranch, I forgot about the picture. One day, the doctor called again and asked if he could visit the ranch to talk to me in person. I agreed, and we set a date. When he arrived, we decided to ride out to one of the high meadows to take in the view. On the way, we made small talk, but I sensed he had something heavy on his mind. Once we dismounted and sat in the grass, enjoying the quiet, he broke the silence. "We've been making progress with your wife," he said. "She's lost about 100 pounds, and she's becoming more aware of her appearance. She's starting to ask the nurses to brush her hair. She still doesn't speak, but she'll point to a brush when she wants her hair done." He paused before continuing. "However, when we show her the picture of you, she starts screaming, 'He's going to eliminate me too,' and she goes into a frenzy. We usually have to sedate her." He looked at me, waiting for a response, and then asked, "Is there any truth to her fear? Is there something I need to know?" I sat in silence for a long time, trying to figure out what to say. Finally, I made up my mind. "I'll tell you everything," I said. "But first, I need to know, if I tell you, will it stay between us?" He assured me it would be fine, so I began telling the whole story. I explained that I grew up in a crime family, with my uncle as the Don. While I wasn't involved in the violence, I was the trusted bookkeeper, handling all the money, legal and illegal. My wife knew everything. Then I told him about coming home early one day to find her in bed with Tony, my enemy. Tony's smug look enraged me, and I snapped. I grabbed a bat and started striking him. "I don't remember do it, Tommy wife, but when I came to, she was on the floor, bruised. I explained how my cousin's crew made Tony disappear, staged my wife's fall, and started a fire to cover it up. They made it look like an accident, and the fire department found her at the bottom of the stairs." After I finished, the doctor listened quietly. He eventually spoke, saying my blind rage made sense, and I had probably blocked out hitting my wife to protect myself. He suggested that in my case it might be best not to dig up those memories, but warned me to watch for certain signs and call him if they appeared. We talked more, and I mentioned my son's anger toward his mother. The doctor suggested bringing him in to talk and work through it. Later, as we rode back to the main house, he advised me to stay away from my ex-wife for now, but encouraged my daughter to visit her often. Life moved on. My daughter was in college, studying pre-med, and my son was in his freshman year, planning to join me on the ranch. Then I started hearing a lot about Bill. My daughter talked about him all the time, so I casually suggested she invite him to Thanksgiving dinner. An hour later, she called and asked if Bill could stay with us since his parents were traveling for the holidays. I agreed, already knowing what was happening. When they arrived, I was pleasantly surprised. Bill was polite, about 6 feet tall, with sandy hair, brown eyes, and studying to be a surgeon. I liked him, and so did the ranch hands, who started teasing me about becoming Gramps. By Valentine's Day, they were engaged, and the wedding was set for August. Soon, I found myself in a church foyer, waiting nervously for my daughter to arrive. The priest reassured me, "They're always late." When she finally walked down the aisle, I was overwhelmed. She looked beautiful, and all my nerves vanished. As I led her to Bill, I noticed a wheelchair in the front row and realized it was my ex-wife, sitting with Dr. Howie. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen her since the hospital. My daughter squeezed my arm and whispered, "It's okay, Daddy." I invited her. I nodded, feeling a swirl of emotions. As I passed my ex-wife, I saw she was calm, fragile, but no longer angry. Dr. Howie gave me a reassuring smile, and I realized how far things had come. When the priest declared them husband and wife, I teared up, and I noticed my ex-wife crying too. The emotions were clearly overwhelming her. I tried to move aside to avoid blocking her view, but Dr. Howie grabbed my arm and whispered, "Don't touch her yet. She's still fragile." Later at the reception, I danced with my daughter, and she said, "Mom's come a long way, hasn't she?" I nodded, admitting I was proud of her. The bitterness I once felt had softened, and seeing her at the wedding, knowing what she had been through, made me realize how time heals even the deepest wounds. I decided to call Dr. Howie the next week to check in. When we spoke, he explained my ex-wife's progress, noting that attending the wedding was a major step forward. He said, "You could have set her back years just by touching her, but sitting near you was a huge breakthrough." I asked how he got her to accept being in the same room as me. He explained that it started with a photo I had sent him, which he slowly moved closer to her over months. Eventually, she could talk about me, and that led to her attending the wedding. He also shared that she had started to remember the day with Tony, recalling how he used her as a shield. This realization helped her process what happened, and while she's still afraid of me on some level, she no longer believes I meant to eliminate her. She's working through it. I asked, "So she's not there yet, but she's making progress?" Dr. Howie confirmed, "Yes, but you need to be patient. There's still a long journey ahead." Weeks later, my daughter called and asked if her mother could join us for Thanksgiving. She reassured me that Dr. Howie thought it would be good for her, so I agreed, on the condition that Dr. Howie and his wife joined too. When Thanksgiving came, my ex-wife arrived looking much better, though the room felt tense at first. Gradually, she joined some conversations, and I kept my distance to avoid adding any stress. At dinner, I was asked to give the blessing. As I prayed, I included a special request for my ex-wife's healing. When I glanced at her, she smiled at me for the first time in years. It was small and hesitant, but it was there. My daughter cried, and my son seemed stunned. After dinner, as I rested in the living room, I felt someone near me. I peeked and saw my ex-wife by my side, staring at my hand. After a few moments, I felt the lightest touch, and then it was gone. It returned, this time firmer. I didn't move, not wanting to disrupt whatever small connection we were making. Eventually, she pulled away, and I saw Dr. Howie talking gently with her, holding her hands. That night, after everyone had left, I had a conference call with Dr. Howie and my daughter. We agreed that my ex-wife was making great progress, so we decided she could spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day at the ranch. Dr. Howie couldn't attend, but he put my daughter in charge of her care and advised me to let my ex initiate any contact. When Christmas Eve arrived, I was anxious and tried to stay busy around the ranch. Suddenly, my ex-wife called my name, and I cautiously approached. She softly said, "Please don't be afraid of me. I know you never meant to hurt me. Can we be friends again?" I nodded, fighting back tears, and she gently wiped them away. My daughter and son witnessed it and seemed relieved. Later that night, my ex-wife needed help getting to bed. When I offered to find someone to assist her, she asked me to do it. Hesitant at first, I lifted her from the wheelchair, and she wrapped her arms around me, almost like a hug. After settling her in bed, she didn't want to let go right away. Eventually, she released me, and I tucked her in. As I leaned down to kiss her goodnight, she turned her head, offering only her cheek. I realized I had pushed things too far. That night, I had the strange feeling she had wheeled herself into my room while I slept. The next morning, I found her at the top of the stairs, waiting for help. She raised her arms and whispered, "Please," so I carried her down to breakfast. The room fell silent, but the moment passed quickly. Later, we gathered around the Christmas tree, our first holiday together in 17 years. I noticed my ex-wife sitting among piles of gifts, quietly crying. My daughter walked over and said, "Mom, we've got 17 years of gifts to catch up on." My ex-wife smiled and returned to opening her presents. During dinner, she shyly asked if she could spend New Year's with us too. I quickly said yes, and she gave me a hug, whispering, "Thank you." We spent a wonderful week together, and after everyone left, it was just the two of us at the ranch. On her last night, a storm knocked out the power, and she came to my room, saying her room was freezing. She asked if she could sleep with me. I don't remember saying yes, but suddenly, she was beside me. She laid out some rules. No sex, no kissing, but cuddling was allowed. I wrapped my arms around her and she said, "I've missed your smell. It's the smell of a real man." We talked quietly for hours, and the next morning, due to the snowstorm, she stayed an extra day. I noticed she wasn't as helpless as she seemed, moving easily between the wheelchair and furniture. When I asked her about it, she admitted, "I just wanted to feel your arms around me again." Later that afternoon, Dr. Howie called and talked to her for over 2 hours. I overheard parts of the conversation and realized that in all our years together, she had never opened up to me like she did with him. When she passed me the phone, Dr. Howie said, "This is the best I've seen her in years, but there's one more issue she needs to face before she can truly move forward." I asked what it was, but he only said, "She'll tell you when she's ready." I waited, and 2 weeks before Easter, I got the call. It was my ex-wife asking if she could join us for Easter at the ranch because she had something important to share. I agreed, and a few days before the holiday I picked her up from the hospital. She looked exhausted, weighed down by something heavy. We spent the afternoon at the ranch, surrounded by blooming wildflowers, sharing a quiet moment as if we had never been apart. That night she asked to sleep with me again, saying, "I miss being held by you." Later, I woke to her moving beside me. When I tried to stop her, she whispered, "I need to do this for you." And she started crying. As I tried to comfort her, she reminded me of the no kissing rule. Then, she opened up. She told me how Tony had manipulated her using pills, gaining complete control. She had mental health struggles for years, and Tony used them against her, making her dependent to him like a pill. She described the night I found them together, saying she didn't know I was there until Tony used her as a shield to protect himself from my blows. She remembered the pain in her back and being pushed to the floor before blacking out, waking only when a fireman rescued her from the burning house. The doctors had told her that night caused the spinal injury that led to her paralysis, and it triggered a mental breakdown that lasted for 14 years. Then she revealed the biggest shock. Tony or one of his associates had given her HIV, which had progressed to AIDS due to her lack of care during her years of madness. The doctors could only keep her comfortable now, and she told me she wouldn't make it to next Christmas. We cried together all night, and the next day, we shared the news with the family. On Easter morning, we attended Mass together, seeking God's help in the difficult days ahead. In October, she passed away peacefully. She had requested to be cremated and for her ashes to be spread under a large oak tree near the hospital, where she and Dr. Howie had their conversations that brought her back from the darkness. It was a special place for her. The following spring, I had a marble bench installed beneath the oak tree with a plaque that included her name, dates, and the words, "The world was a little better while she was here." I visited that bench often, sitting in the quiet and reflecting on all that had happened. Sometimes I'd play golf with Dr. Howie and catch up on life, and afterward I'd stop by the hospital, sit on the bench, and update her on what the family was up to. Despite everything, I realized I had always loved her. One day I got a call from my daughter and son-in-law. They had exciting news. I was going to be a grandfather. As I sat on the bench under that oak tree, I couldn't help but smile. Life had come full circle. A few years later, my son, who was in his senior year of college, called me up. "Dad, do you mind if I bring a friend home for Thanksgiving?" he asked. He's studying to be a vet, and he'd love to see the ranch. It was the first time since he left for school that he'd made such a request, so I happily agreed. The week before Thanksgiving, I saw my black H2 Hummer pull into the driveway. That Hummer was my pride and joy, and it had its own story. Months earlier, I had found my son's subcompact parked in the garage, but my truck was gone. There was a note in the compact: "Needed more cargo space. Took your truck. Love, Sam." I spent the whole day grumbling, but then I remembered how bad the Hummer's gas mileage was and realized my son had outsmarted himself. Still, I let it go. He's my only son, after all. When the Hummer stopped near where I was standing, my son hopped out, and the passenger door opened. I was stunned. Out stepped one of the most beautiful redheads I'd ever seen. She was about 5'6", with striking green eyes. My son took her hand and walked her over to me. I found myself staring into Shauna's eyes as my son introduced us. Over the next few days, I got to know her. She was an only child raised by her divorced mother. Her father had left them for a younger woman when she was young, leaving them with nothing but debt. Despite it all, Shauna had worked hard, earned a scholarship, and maintained a 3.8 GPA while working as a waitress to support herself. I was proud my son had found such an intelligent, hardworking young woman. Over Thanksgiving, the two of them spent their days looking over the livestock, but I suspected they were growing closer in other ways too. Before they left, Shauna received an invitation to spend Christmas with us, and I couldn't have been happier. I felt like she already belonged in the family. A couple of days later, my son called with a problem. Shauna really wants to spend Christmas with us, but she doesn't want her mom to be alone. What should we do? For me, the solution was obvious. I told him to invite her mom to spend the holidays at the ranch, too. We had plenty of space, and if she didn't want to stay in the main house, we had plenty of guest houses for the Dude Ranch visitors. A week later, everything was set. I arranged for her mom to have a first-class ticket to the nearest airport, and Shauna and my son would pick her up and drive to the ranch together. When the day came for them to arrive, I found myself outside, waiting with excitement. My daughter and her family had also just arrived, so we all gathered in the driveway. Shauna hopped out of the front seat, followed by her mom from the back. I was speechless. Shauna's mom, Bridget, was a slightly older version of her daughter, red hair, green eyes, and the kind of beauty that comes with age. I stood there dumbfounded until my daughter walked up and whispered, "Dad, close your mouth. You're embarrassing us." I snapped out of it and walked over to greet Bridget. She gave me a dazzling smile. My daughter handed her baby, Amanda, to Bridget, probably because she didn't trust me to hold my granddaughter in my days. The 2 weeks flew by. I took Bridget on tours of the ranch. She had owned a horse before her divorce and was a skilled rider, so I matched her with a gentle mare, and we toured the ranch together. She loved the views and the animals, and we talked about our lives and families as we rode. By the time she left, I felt like I knew her better than most couples know each other after decades of marriage. We chatted like old friends. After everyone left, the ranch felt empty. Even though I had 15 employees, I couldn't wait for spring break when the kids would return. Bridget said she didn't think she could get time off to visit. When the kids arrived for spring break, I made a call to the doctor Bridget worked for. "Any way I can make sure Bridget gets some time off?" I asked. "I don't see why not," he replied. "I'd be happy to help." We agreed that I would cover her salary for 2 weeks and pay for a temp to replace her. I also called my cousin to borrow his plane. Who said crime doesn't pay? When it was time for her flight, I called Bridget and told her, "The schedule has changed. You'll need to bring your luggage to work, and a car will pick you up and take you to the airport." Later that day, a chauffeur in uniform walked into Bridget's office and asked, "May I take your luggage, Miss Bridget?" He then escorted her to a stretch limo. As they drove off, her coworkers stood in the doorway, stunned, with their mouths open. Bridget called me. "Is this your doing?" she asked, half laughing, half in disbelief. "Maybe," I replied, amused. She was still thanking me when the limo pulled up next to my cousin's Gulfstream. The chauffeur introduced her to the pilot, who then escorted her onto the plane. Her cell phone was still connected to me, but she had gone silent. All I could hear were soft sobs. I waited until the plane's signal cut off before hanging up. I think she was impressed. A year earlier, my cousin had complained about the long trip from the nearest airport to my ranch. "You need an airstrip on your property," he said, half joking. I thought about it and decided he was right. We found a suitable spot on my land, and about a month later, construction began. A few months after that, I had a 10,000-foot runway with all the trimmings and a large hangar for the plane. When I called my cousin to ask, "What's my share of the cost?" he just laughed and said, "Don't worry about it." That's where I was, sitting in my pickup, when the plane landed and Bridget stepped out. She immediately started bombarding me with questions. "How did you pull all this off? What's going on?" she asked, wide-eyed. I laughed and promised, "I'll explain everything after dinner." That night, after dinner, we sat in my study. I had a small fire going and we were sipping brandy. I began telling her the story. "I was raised by one of the largest crime families on the East Coast," I admitted, watching her face for a reaction. "I wasn't involved in the family business, but I enjoyed many of the benefits. The jet you just flew on is one of those perks. Bridget paused for a moment before asking, "Were you ever involved in any of their activities?" "No," I said firmly. I stayed out of it, but I couldn't deny the privileges. She asked a few more questions, mostly to understand my moral boundaries. After a while, she seemed satisfied with my answers. Without a word, she walked over and sat next to me on the couch, resting her head on my shoulder. We stayed like that until we were too tired to stay awake, and then went to our separate rooms. The next morning, she was back to her usual self. At Easter dinner, I made a mistake. I casually asked my son, "Did you take Shauna to meet your mother at the hospital?" I heard Bridget's fork drop suddenly. I glanced at her and gave her a look that said, "We'll talk later." She didn't finish her meal. That night, I brought her into my study. She sat as far away from me as she could, hugging herself, clearly hurting. "Bridget," I began softly, "I need to tell you everything. I don't want to have any secrets between us." She nodded but stayed silent. I started talking, and for the next 2 hours I told her everything. I explained the cheating, my ex falling down the stairs to escape the fire and breaking her back, her paralysis, and her descent into madness. I told her how I ran away, started the ranch, and eventually reconnected with my children. I described how we found their mother in a state institution, neglected, and how I arranged to have her transferred to a private hospital where she received proper care. I explained how she regained some sanity with the help of a kind doctor, and how she ultimately passed away from AIDS, contracted from her lover. By the time I finished, tears were running down my face. Bridget rushed into my arms, saying, "You're a wonderful man. I think I could love you." She was crying too, and I held her tightly. After a moment, I asked, "Would you like to come with me sometime to visit my ex-wife's grave?" 3 days later, we made the trip to the hospital. We sat on a bench all afternoon, talking about our lives and updating my ex in spirit. On the way back, Bridget never let go of my hand. I knew then that our relationship couldn't continue as we wanted. While the feelings were real, acting on them would complicate things. We never became lovers. Sometimes you just need someone to share your feelings with. We were content with that. Life goes on.